Good afternoon and welcome to InFocus. Today we're putting the Assembly of First Nations in focus. We want you to join in on our conversation. Our phone lines are now open. Call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Use the hashtag AFN. Now, the Assembly of First Nations will be holding an election for National Chief at its annual general meeting in late July in Vancouver. Perry Bellegarde says he will be seeking re-election. Fortunately, Perry Bellegarde was unavailable for today's show. So was Sheila North, the current Grand Chief of Manitoba, Kwaitanowye Okimakanak, who says she will be running for National Chief as well. Joining us from Ottawa are two of the candidates who have also made their intentions known. I know Russ is for sure with us. Russ is a Kahnawake Mohawk policy analyst, writer, and activist. I understand Miles Richardson has not quite showed up yet in Ottawa, a former president of the Haida Nation. Hopefully he'll be joining us soon. Both are seeking the role of National Chief. In studio, we have Pam Palmater, Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and activist. Also in studio with us is Derek Nepenak, the former Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And we also have with us Paul Barnsley, the executive producer of APTN Investigates. Paul has been covering the AFN for many years, we'll say, Paul.
Yeah, leave numbers out of it.
And last but not certainly not least, joining us from Calgary via Skype is lawyer Rachel Ann Snow, a critic of the AFN in its current role. Thank you all for joining us. Russ, if we could start with you in Ottawa and a little on why you've decided to put your name forward for AFN National Chief.
Well, I think we're at a critical time. The Trudeau agenda is proceeding ahead basically through legislation. He's planning a recognition act that's coming. I think that that's a danger to our rights because they're going to be defining those through their policies, their comprehensive claims policies, their self-government policy, and these new fiscal policies they're bringing in. And it's my belief they're going to use the funding to force us into these modern agreements. And I see to me, the National Chief, Perry Bellegarde, has lost control of the agenda and the process and the pen, and the Trudeau government seems to be in charge of defining what our rights are now.
Paul, are there...
That's why I've decided to run.
Thanks, Russ. Paul, are there other names that you've been hearing out there aside from the previously mentioned names?
Well, yeah, there's a couple. I've heard there's people working on Cindy Blackstock to see if they can get her interested in the job. And Isidore Day so far is saying no, but the deadline's not for a few weeks yet. I'd say those are the two biggest names that haven't come to ground yet. Who knows if they will.
Pam, yourself, many of the stories that are talking about who is going to be running for National Chief include you breaking the news to those reporters, it seems. Have you been hearing any other names out there?
Well, I heard that Catherine Whitecloud might be throwing her name in. Aside from the ones that Paul mentioned and the ones that we mentioned today, I haven't really heard anyone else, but you never know. Sometimes people throw their names in at the last minute for lots of different political strategy reasons, to split the votes in certain provinces or to make agreements on the side. You never know who will at the last minute.
I know we've talked about it before, Pam, but no announcements coming from yourself anytime soon?
No, I will not be running again for National Chief of the AFN.
Derek, any names that you're hearing out there?
I think we've covered the gamut of what I've heard out there, and I want to just send my respects and commend those folks who are brave enough to step up for a role that is obviously very challenging. And as Russ said, it's a very critical time, and we need strong leaders to step up at this time. But whether or not the AFN is the right forum for strong leadership at this time, considering the multitude of perspectives and the resurgence, the revitalization of the Indigenous voice in the Canadian landscape is well upon us now, and whether the AFN is the right place to carry that voice remains to be a question to be answered.
Russ, have you received support from the 15 or so chiefs that you'll need to get your name on the ballot? And are you concerned about getting votes for that, given how you've spoken out about the AFN and termination tables and things of that nature?
I've taken some heat from some chiefs about my use of the term termination tables. But I believe I have my 15 nominators lined up. I'm just waiting for the electoral officer to release the nomination paper so I can start getting signatures to paper.
Russ, maybe I'll ask you, since you are running, have you heard any other names who might be your competitors out there?
Just the names you mentioned. I was a little surprised to hear that there's a campaign to get Cindy Blackstock involved. She'd be a great candidate. Isidore Day, I'm pretty sure he would be a good candidate, but I don't believe he's going to run. But I agree with Grand Chief, former Grand Chief Nipanak. AFN, as it's currently structured, is not the organization to address our rights. Mm-hmm. It has to be fundamentally changed. Mm-hmm. And the charter has to be rewritten.
Something we're certainly going to come back to. Rachel, you use the hashtag Team Russ often on Twitter as a critic of the AFN. What is it about Russ that you support?
Well, I think that, first of all, that AFN right now is not answering to the true leadership. Even what you're discussing who's running for this one position, this one post, when in reality, governance is that the people are the leader. So I think that the structuring that has to happen so that the people are actually the voice of what drives the Indigenous future in this country. I think that a person like Russ is looking at restructuring. I can't see restructuring from any other candidates coming forward. And I think with the restructuring, what it means is that not one person has all power vested in them. The power is returned to the people.
Rachel, while we have you there, when we're talking about this, should it only be the chiefs who select a national chief?
We're going to get into this. It could be longer than the time schedule. I have put out my analysis that Indian agents who disturbed our traditional governance in our communities, and then Indian Act that elections for our communities have produced a host of Indian Act chief or Indian agent. So with that Indian agent mentality is not leadership, it's a colonial mentality. It's not the traditional governance, it's not the heart of the people, it's not spirituality, it's not all the things we talk about that make us Indigenous. So if we're going to keep going forward as Indigenous, we actually have to be Indigenous people with our spirituality, with our languages, with our ceremonies, and with our own governance structure. And that's not happening in a colonial setting. Not at the band level, regional level, or at the national level.
Pam, do you feel there should be a shakeup in the way that the national chief's elected?
Yeah, I do. And I think that the current structure where you have different First Nations, either by chief or by proxy, who might only have 30 band members or 40 band members, gets to vote for the national chief in the same way that one First Nation that has 20,000 band members votes. So you're really talking about a disproportionate amount of power that's really coalesced in a certain number of First Nations in a particular region. And that really impacts how the AFN is governed and to whose interests it caters to nowadays. I don't think it was ever intended to be that way. And I think here's the other danger about your question that you just asked Rachel. You might be surprised, but I wouldn't want the AFN to set up a structure where they're acting like a national government, like a federal government for First Nations, where grassroots citizens vote for them, and it gives them even more power and more legitimacy and more control over what is essentially our sovereign sovereign First Nations. I think the AFN has gone well beyond what it used to be when it was the National Indian Brotherhood, which was advocacy, and have really gone into this empire building and deal making, which it shouldn't be doing for the actual sovereign nations on the ground, including those people.
Former Grand Chief, you've come to power, I guess, in both ways, as chief of your community, elected by the people, and as AMC Grand Chief. Do you think the way a national chief is selected currently is the way to keep things?
I think I'd have to echo the same sentiment as Pam in this instance, because I think what we're really talking about is the legitimacy of representation. And there is a public face of the AFN, but when you pull back the curtains, you see that AFN is actually operated as a federal agency. And their lines of accountability go back to the federal funders that oversee their funding. So, you know, to create a message that goes out to our grassroots community members that says, you know, vote for a national chief, I think that's I think a little bit misdirected, simply because we don't have an enabling or an empowering governance structure for a national body that would allow it to, I think, advocate to that extent and to take on that degree of responsibility. I think that the starting point has always been at our home fires, and there's many legitimate and solid leaders out there that come from their home fire community that have been lifted and raised up by the women and put into power in that way. And I think that's where it ties into Rachel's comments as well, is that we have to redefine what legitimate representation looks like and figure out whether or not there's a place for that in a national discussion or not.
Paul, it's been a little over 4 years since the election of Perry Bellegarde to National Chief. Have we seen, there been gains, do you think, for people in that 4 years?
Depends how you define the word, I suppose. Definitely a lot more money going in and out of the AFN headquarters in Ottawa. A lot more jobs. Some people tell me a lot more patronage. Apparently, a useful thing when the government approves of you is the funding levels go up, and you can create employment for people who will probably vote for you in the next election. That's what I'm told. I have no proof of that, but I believe it. There has been a lot of work done with the AFN and with the federal government. Nothing has really changed, I guess, yet. You know, we're still waiting for results, and sometimes you wait so long you forget you're waiting, and that has been the case many times in the past in these processes. So I really, yeah, things are different from where they were before, but I'm not sure you could say there's change with a capital C.
Russ, do you think there's been some gains in the past 4 years? We've seen, you know, some new schools built, boil water advisories lifted. Maybe it's not been enough, but has there been some gains in the last 4 years?
Well, I recently heard a regional chief say that it's night and day between Harper and Trudeau, meaning that Trudeau for the past 2.5 years has been very positive compared to Stephen Harper as Prime Minister. But I told that regional chief I disagreed. It seems that way on the surface. As Paul points out, they've added almost $20 billion in new funding on top of the billions that were already being spent. But if you look at AFN signing these memorandums of understanding on fiscal relations and joint priorities, you know, setting up this cabinet committee, it hasn't done anything about the federal government operating in secret and, you know, through deception, through communications or public relations. I'll give you some examples. The 10 principles they issued last summer, they're basically reinforcing the doctrine of discovery, the Constitution Act 1867, where the federal and provincial governments will continue to dominate us. The decision to dissolve the Department of Indian Affairs and create 2 new departments. That was all done in secret without even letting AFN know. Mm-hmm. And our people, you know, there's a reason why there's going to be 2 new departments, and the government hasn't laid that out yet, but it's tied to the new fiscal relations policy they're bringing in, which is the other thing that our people should be concerned about. So AFN hasn't said anything critically about this. There's been no critical analysis of these government initiatives. And there should be. That's AFN's job. And also Bill C-68 on the Fisheries Act, Bill C-69, the Omnibus Bill on Environment and the National Energy Board. There's been no critical analysis of that, and I think it's detrimental to our Aboriginal and treaty rights.
Rachel, you're joining us from Calgary, but you live on reserve. Have you noticed a difference in your quality of life or those around you in the past 4 years?
Totally. Not at all, because again, we're talking about the disconnect that happens from Ottawa to the region to the reserves or to our community. So if you're talking about what the Indigenous want, I think it's important to get out into the grassroots voices, because all we ever see is opulent meetings, places where the grassroots can't afford to get in, and there's discussions happening that are relevant to our future, our children, and to the rights that Russ is pointing to. And if we don't have a voice, and I've stated better said or put by Pam and Eric, that it is representation and it is governance that we're talking about at the very level of our communities, where there is the collective voice versus the individual or that hierarchy. So until we come together, no reconciliation. We're talking about many voices that need to be heard. When Ottawa, the mainstream government only listened to one voice, and we need all voices there.
Grand Chief, you're a former Grand Chief. You were Grand Chief through a good chunk of this term. Was there a noticeable change, and did you have trouble getting your voice heard in Ottawa?
I've always, knocked on the doors that I needed to have my voice heard, but I did notice that, a lot of the momentum that was built, not by AFN, but by particular, people and movements across the country, built the momentum to topple the Harper government. And, the AFN seemed to ride on that wave a little bit to a lot of new funding announcements and so forth. And some of that money did trickle into the region. I'll be very honest, Regional Chief Kevin Hart did his best to make sure that some of that funding did make it into Manitoba. But at the same time, what was going on at the AFN table, largely in Ottawa, was beyond the purview of my responsibilities as running an independent arm's-length organization here in Manitoba. And I can't say that's consistent across the board, because I know in some regions, the Grand Chief of an organization is also the regional chief, and that's not the case here in Manitoba. So there is a separation there, and I think that allowed me to be a little more critical of some of the things that the AFN was doing. But it also meant that my mandates were fairly tightly wrapped up when I left Manitoba and went to the AFN table. It wasn't for me to open up mandates created here in Manitoba to negotiate at an AFN table, and I think that created some miscommunication at times with some of the leadership.
Paul, we're going to lose you here in a couple of minutes, and I didn't want to point out before, but you have covered the AFN for decades. What have you noticed in the evolution of the body that stands out for you?
Well, the one key moment, I had to send out an email a couple of weeks ago internally, because it's been going on for so long it's forgotten. But every assembly now is a special assembly because of what Pam referred to earlier, where technically by the AFN Constitution, every chief doesn't get a vote, even at just a regular assembly, never mind for voting for national chief. And there was a big fight between Ontario and BC during Phil Fontaine's second term, I believe. And Phil, who was a very creative man, a very intelligent man, came up with this fix where he called them special assemblies, and that way every chief could vote. And that sort of unleashed different political forces. If there was a vote rep by pop, I guess is what a political science teacher would call it, or prof. If you only got so many votes per the population, per thousands, it would be a very different animal. So they're not technically in compliance with the charter of the AFN, although there's nothing wrong. It's just they've decided, Phil, many years ago, decided to deviate away from that. I don't know if Russ wants to debate that, if he thinks his chances are better. But I hope I'm answering your question, Dennis. But it's the one thing, and I learned this from Russ back when he was a backroom guy advising young reporters, that watch the money going into the organization. When the government approves of you, lots of money goes in. When the government doesn't approve of you, things get a little bit more difficult. And I mean, if I was Perry Bellegarde today, I would realize that's an optic problem for him in this campaign. The government clearly approves of him. And, you know, historically, governments don't approve of chiefs who are standing up for rights and being difficult for federal officials. But that's nothing new. It's been that way for as long as, I think my first one was in '94. When Ovid was running for his last term, or got his last term. And it was like that then. It's like that now.
Sorry, Russ.
Maybe I could add a
quickly.
If I could add a point.
Yep.
Yeah, the charter was set up to have checks and balances. The organs of the assembly are the chiefs in assembly being the highest decision-making body, and then there's what they call the Confederacy of Nations. And it's there that there's supposed to be one rep for every 10,000, individual status Indians, I guess you could say. And that's where it became the heads of the provincial territory organizations and the tribal councils. But the chiefs were showing up to vote there as well, and they were arguing over that. As Paul pointed out, BC and Ontario had disagreements over that structure. So they stopped having Confederacy meetings under Phil, and they only held the annual General Assembly and then special assemblies in December for the Christmas party, I guess. And the problem is the executive committee then doesn't come under the transparency and accountability that was intended, except every 6 months when there's an assembly. So by the time you have an assembly, things that the executive did that the chiefs may want to question are behind, and you're onto something else. So that's a real problem with the lack of accountability of the executive to chiefs.
And Russ, I'll hold you there. We do have to step aside for a quick break. Paul, appreciate you joining us. You've got to step aside yourself. And when we return, we'll look at some of the comments we received on some of our questions about the AFN over the past week on social media. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Like our APTN InFocus Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, or call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Welcome back. We're going to go to social media now, and the board I can never get to work to hear what some of you are saying about today's topic, and has the relationship between First Nations and the federal government improved during Perry Bellegarde's time as national chief. Gregory says, why does the AFN even play a role in the relationship between First Nations and the feds? They are sellouts and not elected by the people. Our next comment says, the truth is we, the First Nations, have to be responsible for our own people in our respective traditional territories. We can't rely on anyone else to speak on our behalf. And I got it to work. Daryl says, the AFN has done nothing to stop the apartheid and all forms of racism and discrimination against the majority of Aboriginals living in mainstream Canada. To a comment from Margaret. No, Trudeau is ignoring the First Nations in BC who opposed the pipeline. During the election, he loved us all. Now he stands up in the House of Commons and defends his big business buddies. We also asked, should the Assembly of First Nations become less dependent on government funding? And Ernie says, absolutely. The AFN needs to move away and be independent. The AFN's financial existence depends on funding from Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development. And finally, we have Clive here who says, yes, as it stands now, the AFN is seen as pandering to its political masters who write their paycheck. And that's something we're going to discuss here in just a few minutes. But first, here's how you can get involved in the conversation. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Like our APTN InFocus Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus or call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. And welcome back. Our guests are still here. Pam Palmander, former Grand Chief of AMC, Derek Nepanak, Russ Diabo in Ottawa, and Rachel Ann Snow joining us via Skype from Calgary. I believe we're still waiting for Miles, but I guess we'll move on at the moment and talk about some of the commentary you hear about how the Assembly of First Nations is overly dependent on Ottawa, something we just heard from there. And, Russ, do you believe the AFN is still relevant? I'm guessing so, since you're running for the top job.
Well, I'm running, part of the reason is to see AFN restructured in a serious way. It needs to be decentralized, and there needs to be something similar more to like a United Nations structure instead of the structure it has now. That's what I believe. Even the position of National Chief and the Executive Committee, I think those need to be looked at and transitioned into something else which is broader with more representatives. But I did speak to Dale Montour. She was on the committee for the National Indian Brotherhood along with Ernie Benedict when they transitioned from the National Indian Brotherhood to the AFN structure. And she said the original intention wasn't to have 10 vice chiefs. That was something that came about as they started discussing the transition. And basically it was organized along provincial lines. Every province, provincial organization said, well, we need to have a voice. So that's why you have 10 vice chiefs now. And that's something that really needs to be looked at, I said. Plus the fact that Confederacy isn't even meeting anymore. So that whole charter needs to be rewritten, and there needs to be a role for the people. Otherwise, the legitimacy of the organization is gone.
Pam, you have previously ran, but that was a few years back. Do you still believe that the AFN is relevant today?
It's not that the AFN is relevant, and here's how I explain it to people. When our rights are at stake, and they're always at stake, and they always will be, it doesn't matter what government is in play. We are always going to have to defend our rights and keep them protected. The issue is not how do we protect an organization, an entity that's incorporated and gets funding and it has staff members. It's how do we protect our people, our lands, our resources, and our rights, our sovereignty as peoples. That's the most important thing. And if the choice is, at the end of the day, the AFN as it currently is, and it's been going for well over a decade, which is sacrificing our rights or protecting our rights, then everyone in the AFN and the building could be gone. The whole entity could be closed up, but we're still here, and the focus is too much on the AFN and having to save it and staff it, and then you lose focus from, well, it's actually the First Nations on the ground and our rights that are the most important, and how is that organization facilitating what we need on the ground like it used to do when it was the NIB, where it was critical of the government, where it pushed agendas. If all you're doing is hiring a mouthpiece for the federal government, that's a waste of money. And I think one of the true tests of the usefulness of the AFN would be don't have any federal or provincial funding and let the funding come from the First Nations who believe you are making a critical difference, who you are adding something to their community. And we would see how well or how much of a lack there would be to AFN funding. And I think if that was the choice right now, you would see that it probably wouldn't be an organization.
I'm going to come right back to that. But Rachel, just from yourself, does the AFN hold any relevancy for you currently?
Currently, right now as it stands, no. Because it is just exactly what the other speakers have said. It is just an arm of the government. They are not advocating for sovereignty. They're actually falling into these traps of advocating for Indian affairs policies like self-government termination tables, the rights recognition legislation. Everything that they are doing is following the federal agenda. There is nothing that they're doing to ensure people on the ground that our treaty right to education, our right to water, our right to protect our land are being addressed. None of that is happening.
Former Grand Chief, you've seen how funding can dry up at times. When you were with AMC, there were some big cuts there, big choices to make, I guess, for yourselves. There are concerns that should there be concerns when the AFN disagrees with government that funding's going to go away?
I think that's a very real problem. It's not just the AFN, it's political organizations that are run by Indigenous people across the country. These are sponsored agencies of the federal government. The money comes from the top down, not from the bottom up. And as Pam said, if we were funding it from the bottom up, we would see where the people's priorities are because they would put their money where their priorities are. But we're not structured that way. And the AMC is no exception to that rule. When I was the Grand Chief and we spoke out against the Harper government, against policies that were being driven by Michael Warnick at the time as the leader of the department, we received an 85% funding cut to our core funding because we had lost our utility as an agent of federal policy in Ottawa, and we began speaking from a more empowered grassroots approach, and we directed our agenda towards what could bring potentially real change, and that didn't resonate well in Ottawa because we were no longer being pulled around by their agenda. And it is tied to the money because as soon as federal government wants to prioritize an issue, it will sprinkle some money into a circle and co-opt that discussion. It's a process of being co-opted, and that's oftentimes what ends up happening. I'm not saying that good people are at fault for this, because some of our best people are going into those co-opted circles without really perhaps knowing what the real intention behind the money is. And we've been in that cycle for decades.
And Dennis, I would just add, there's a core difference between, you get funded. Hundreds of civil society organizations all over Canada get federal and provincial funding. Simply getting funding contributions in and of itself isn't necessarily an evil, as long as what you're doing is what you're set up to do. And there's lots of anti-poverty, anti-homeless, women's groups, human rights organizations that have different pots of government funding, but they're still advocating, they're still being critical, they're still pushing the government, right to the maximum on all of those issues. So the AFN itself, despite getting government funding, is really out of step with all of the other civil society organizations in this country. And that shows you that, aside from the funding, there is really something fundamentally wrong at AFN when they have stopped being critical. When has anyone heard them really hammer the government for anything in the last decade?
I'd like to add a point too.
Yeah, go ahead, Russ.
If I could.
Yeah.
Derek mentions an important name, Michael Warnick. Michael Warnick was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs under Harper government for 10 years. He's the one that led the Hotspots campaign against Indigenous communities, spying on Cindy Blackstock. I mean, there's a whole list of things he's done. And one of the first things that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did was he appointed Michael Warnick as clerk of the Privy Council. So he's the top bureaucrat in the country. And it was supposed to be temporary, in January 2016. He's still there, and he's behind a lot of what we're seeing with this legislative agenda that's coming forward now, and the whole approach that the government's taking towards Indigenous policy. And Indigenous people should be very concerned about that because, as far as I'm concerned, he's one of the top federal terminators that Trudeau has retained.
Russ, to you, if you were to become elected national chief, would you be concerned about the money drying up, I guess, is one way to put it, if you were critical of government practices and legislation?
Well, I'm of the view of the same as my friend, the late Art Manuel. When you see the Assembly of First Nations getting a lot of money, you know they're not doing their job. It's when they're down to a lean and mean machine of just maybe having 2, 3, 4 million to just basically operate, then that shows that they're doing their job advocating. And a good example of that is when Ovid McCready was national chief in 1996-97 when we took on the Chrétien government on the supposed Indian Act amendments that were being pushed. We convinced the chiefs to fight back, and I think Ovid was the last national chief to challenge the federal government. You know, the national chiefs since then have not done that, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Russ. I'm going to come back to you about something in a second here, but first we're going to go to a caller, and I believe it's Charmaine Stick is joining us on the line. Charmaine, you have some concerns with the AFN you'd like to raise?
Hi, yes.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon.
Go ahead, Charmaine.
Hi. Yeah, I just want to say that as a part of grassroots people, we're very left out in terms of AFN. AFN was initially set up to help advocate and speak on behalf of all First Nations, grassroots people especially. And within the past few years, nothing like that has been done. For myself, for example, I've been fighting my current leadership and the government in terms of transparency and accountability, which a lot of people don't like, speaking of the FNFTA. And I recently won 2 court cases against my leadership to show their financial transparency and accountability. And all through my fight, it's been 4 years, I've not once received any help or advocacy from the AFN. And no, I don't believe they are relevant to the grassroots people. First of all, they don't go out and they ask the grassroots people if they can speak on our behalf. They take it upon themselves to say, I am going to speak on your behalf, which is not right, it's not fair, and that's not how it was originally set up. I did my own research. I had a grandfather who was working in the treaties. He taught me a lot of things in regards to treaties. And I don't see the AFN fighting for any of our treaties today. It seems more like they're chasing the rubber carrot that's being held out in front of them by the government. And all they're doing is slowly signing away our treaty rights. And my question to Russ and anybody else who is running is, what is your guys' plan? What is your strategy in terms of honoring our treaties, holding our own leaderships within our region and our bands accountable for their actions? I don't see anybody being traditionally responsible. Nobody's taken on the role that we were left by our Creator, by our Mother Earth, to take care of each other's people. But today, it's all about money. It's all about where's the funding coming from. Back in the day, Creator never left us any funding. We're losing our natural laws. We're not following our natural laws, and not following our natural laws causes a lot of chaos, but that's what's happening right now. And so for AFN to be out there saying they speak on our behalf, that in itself is very wrong, because nobody's ever asked me if they could speak on my behalf or my children's behalf. And I think maybe the new AFN chief that's going to come in or wants to run, they should go and be asking the grassroots people if they can speak on their behalf and start coming to see us, rather than having us spend hundreds or try and make money to go and see them. If they're going to speak on our behalf, they should be coming to us, not us chasing them around.
Charmaine, we appreciate you calling in. Russ, maybe before we go to break, did you want to pick up on what she was saying there?
Well, part of the issue is that Assembly of First Nations is a chief's organization, not a people's organization. Their charter makes it clear that that's who the organization is set up for. And the national chief has no inherent authority. If you look at the charter, the national chief's mandates come from resolutions passed by chiefs in assembly, resolutions passed by the executive committee, the Confederacy of Nations, which doesn't meet anymore. So a national chief has to rely on mandates given through those bodies, through resolutions. And often those resolutions can be manipulated and are. So there are issues around the AFN structure and who dominates and gets to control the outcomes, including the mandates of a national chief. You know, how a national chief, the style of a national chief is different from each person. Whether they're male or female, you know, whoever gets in that office, they're going to be stuck with the the charter unless it's changed.
Russ, I'll hold you there as we do have to step aside for one more quick break, but hang around. We'll continue the conversation about the AFN in just a few minutes. Welcome back to In Focus. We are continuing our discussion of the AFN. And before I move on, I should make mention, we've seen some comments online that the National Chief, Perry Bellegarde, we did extend an invitation for him, not only for this week, but for next week. And his schedule just wasn't working out, same as MKO Grand Chief Sheila North, who has also announced she'll be running. And we did put some calls out to some other regional chiefs for the AFN. Unfortunately, Miles Richardson, who's also running, hasn't made it to our studio in Ottawa, but just want to point out that we have reached out to some other people with the AFN and hadn't heard back. But continuing our conversation here, and before the break we were discussing some of the money and how things politically can be tied to that. Russ, maybe if we could start with you on how the AFN could become more economically and politically autonomous.
Well, this issue's been talked about for years, as far as I can recall. And there has been talk about seeking other sources of funding through, foundations or whatever. There's concern about going after corporations because then you're expected to support a corporate agenda. They've talked about getting individual support from individual First Nation citizens, from communities themselves. But really, it comes down to why would anybody fund an organization in Ottawa when they have their own issues locally to look after? And that's where the priorities are. And I think that goes back to AFN changing from being a lobbying and advocacy body into trying to become something more. For example, by signing these agreements with governments. But there are other options I'm sure they could look at in terms of raising funds. But I'm sure it would have to be tied to restructuring the organization and reaffirming its original purpose, I think.
Former Grand Chief, is this something that you struggled with as your time as Grand Chief? And have you any recommendations on how to become more economically and politically autonomous?
Certainly. I think that first and foremost, it's important to recognize that there's a tremendous amount of politics that can be built off the poverty of our people. And when you recognize that and you bring constructive mechanisms to create potentially economic aggregates within our political infrastructure, you need buy-in from the leadership. And it has to be, I think, an idea that resonates well, and sometimes it simply doesn't. Because what's happening in the communities right now for many of our leaders is a daily crisis. You see right here in Manitoba, there's a lot of communities that are removed from their homes because of forest fires. I don't think the chiefs are sitting around talking right now about how to make money in the community. Mm-hmm. They're talking about saving lives. And oftentimes that is the dominating discussion. So when we think about shifting away from reliance on government money to finding more creative solutions, we have to be aware of the reality that a lot of our leadership are working in every day. And it's a daily crisis in many cases. So I became keenly aware of that as the Grand Chief at AMC. We brought some concepts forward about less reliance and creating own source revenue drivers. We opened up the casino at Carberry, for example, and that provides a consistent, steady stream of revenue that is own source revenue that we did put towards advancing our agenda, particularly on CFS and the creation of the Bringing Our Children Home office. And that to me was one of the crowning achievements during my tenure. I think that more organizations should focus on that because own source revenue is going to be the way to I think, drive grassroots-driven initiatives. And
that CFS plan somewhat being put in place here in Manitoba, recommendations here as well as in Ottawa. So I guess, it shows what can be done when you're doing it on your own in some ways.
Absolutely.
Rachel, what would you say to people on why they should even care about this upcoming election for National Chief of the AFN?
Well, I think it depends on the people that you're talking to. As we have heard from Ms. Stick And I'm thankful to all the other people in the grassroots who are in the trenches, who are looking for gas money, who are trying to make it, are in survival mode in their communities. And I hear Mr. Nipenak's comments, but I think sometimes the people are fighting their leadership, and there's no money for that. There's no money support to take on something like when your leadership is trying to do a land designation. We're doing funding, garden sales, bake sales. This is the level that the people are having to do if they're not in survival mode, because many times we're in survival mode. So how do we even begin to care what somebody is doing in Ottawa when our whole day is taken up in survival? And that's where I'm saying the community building, the collective voice that gives direction is the leadership. We don't have a one leader, we have many leaders.
Bellegarde 291.
Sorry, Rachel, I thought you were still talking there.
I heard that noise, so I stopped talking.
Okay. Pam, do you think people out there in the communities that are struggling day to day should care who's elected national chief?
There would be a tendency to say no because there are so many critical issues on the ground in our own nations. However, if the AFN were just irrelevant and useless, then they could say, yeah, sure, no problem. The problem is that the AFN is doing more harm than good. It's actually using a huge amount of our own personal energy and resources to stop AFN from allowing the federal agenda to move forward. And that's actually making more work for us on the ground who are already strained in resources. And that's critically important. If on the ground you're trying to deal with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and child and family services and house fires and floods and everything else, we don't have the time to be putting all of our effort at holding the AFN at bay. But to the credit of many First Nation leaders and traditional leaders and grassroots activists, behind the scenes, what nobody sees, they are keeping AFN at bay. They have withdrawn from the AFN, or they've sent letters saying you don't speak for us, and they're doing separate negotiations with the federal government on key issues away from the AFN. And I see you're going to see this trend moving more and more away from the AFN when they don't have to. I mean, if there was one recommendation anyone could make for the AFN to improve, I mean, aside from all the process and charter issues, is stop usurping our power. Like, back off and respect our sovereignty in the way that we tell the federal government to respect our sovereignty. The AFN is committing the exact same crimes as the federal government. And until they stop doing that, until they stop speaking for the actual rights holders, then the AFN is going to be a hindrance that we have to continue to work against. And so long as they're that way, we can't just dismiss them as irrelevant, but we have to waste our own limited resources to keep them at bay. And that's not what it was set up to do.
Former Grand Chief Nipenak, we only got a minute here or so, but I mean, is it fair to say the AFN had nothing to do with getting the inquiry and seeing some of these changes?
No, and I don't think that's what's being suggested. I think there's a lot of relevancy in what it's doing right now, and I think in its best form, it's facilitating dialogue and it's advocating. But in its very worst, it's making deals behind closed doors that are impacting the lives of people every day. And I think going forward, we have to really think about how are we managing expectations. Do we want AFN to carry a treaty agenda? Do we want them to be making MOUs and signing agreements with the federal government on our behalf? I think that we need an internal dialogue nationally, and I don't think the AFN can do it right now, unfortunately.
Russ, about 30 seconds. If you had one recommendation to improve the AFN, what would that be?
Elect Russ Daibo for National Chief.
Well, you saved some time there with that recommendation. Russ, thanks for joining us from our studio in Ottawa. I know you were busy. We were all, everybody's busy, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. Rachel Ann Snow in Calgary joining us via Skype. Unfortunately, Miles never made it to our Ottawa studio, but in studio here as well. Pam, you switched the flight to be with us, so we appreciate that. Former Grand Chief Nipanak, great to see you, and Paul Barnsley, who joined us earlier today as well. I'd also like to give a big thanks to my producer, Charmaine Stryker, and everybody else here on the crew who worked so hard to put this live show together every week. And we will be back next week for what will be our final show of the season, where we're looking to look ahead to 2018 and look back on some of the headlines. We'll be talking Trans Mountain, the inquiry, and a couple other things, of course. But again, thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Central. I'm Dennis Ward. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.